we had the possibility of looking at what was the status of these children just before the war and see what happened during the war. What this slide tells you is if the last vaccine the child had received was whooping cough, diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis vaccine, then girls, 6% of the girls die against only 2% of the boys during this period of very intensive conflict. It means that among children who had DTP as the last vaccine, mortality was 3 times higher for the girls. You see, if girls had received measles vaccine as their last vaccine, girls had 40% lower mortality than the boys. If this is true, then it has an enormous implication for the mortality pattern. What's the vaccination profile of the trial? And we actually sort of did what you can call a natural experiment during the war. This was not a planned experiment, but we were doing a study of 2 doses of measles vaccine in this trial. And that study implied that you randomized children to measles vaccine in 6 months, and then they got a control vaccine. This is inactivated polio vaccine at 6 months. And then at 9 months, everyone got a measles vaccine, as is official policy. So we were testing whether 2 vaccines were better. Here comes the war. We have 500 kids who have not received who didn't get the 9-month vaccination. So in a sense, we had done a randomized study, though it hadn't been planned. And what happened here during the war was that the children who had received measles vaccine as the last vaccine, they had 70% lower mortality than the children who had the inactivated vaccine at the war. I haven't shown that here, but all of that effect is in the girl. It's not among the boys. Can I have 2 more minutes?
Yes.
I just wanted to illustrate that we had we actually followed some of these issues and studied them afterwards, trying to understand why was mortality lower during the war. I won't have enough time to summarize the whole thing here, but my first conclusion is what I have put up here, that there is an inherent, that's why I'm calling thinking with the stomach. If you are in a war, you think with the stomach. You're scared like hell. It's the stomach which sort of deciding where you're going, what should you do. And the emphasis is on getting the food distribution. But sometimes we're actually getting adverse effect with food distribution because you're bringing people together in situations where they're recipients of this food, and that might actually increase mortality. So there's no security that you are doing the right thing by distributing food the way you are doing it. There are ways to distribute food which minimize that risk. There might be ways which are increasing it. The second thing is that we have interventions. What we could have done better was to, I can speak more about this later in the discussion possibly. I would distinguish between disease prevention and treatment. Some of these things are very critical here, like the TB drugs, getting TB drugs into a conflict situation. But there are also immune enhancement. We are doing things which are enhancing immune system. And those things are potentially much more beneficial than we expect them to be, but they are also potentially damaging. We are doing things out there which can kill children. And I think the conflict crowd really need to look more into these things. What happened at the hospital was afterwards was that mortality, as soon as we stopped providing services to the hospital, mortality went up again. We were considering, what's the reason here? And we initially thought that it was to do with the free drugs. During the war, there had been free drugs to the population. The mothers hadn't to go out to find the drugs. And we provided, with the last of the money we had for humanitarian aid, we provided drugs to the hospital, so they had sort of emergency kits for malaria treatment. And WHO took this on and continued that. It did not lower mortality. It wasn't the drugs which was the most critical factor. What had really been, in our view, the critical factor was that the people who were at the hospital, the nurses and doctors who were at the hospital, they were at the hospital. They were actually working there. They had nothing else to do than to treating the patient during the war. And there was a spirit of trying to improve the survival of the kids. That's not the normal situation in Africa in the hospital. Everyone are doing their small business in order to earn enough money. We actually tried to test this in a randomized trial after the war, 3 years after the war. So we trained everyone in the same way, then we randomized the personnel to an intensive care or to a ward where they got a little bit of extra money for being monitored and filling in all the forms. Whereas the other ward functioned as it usually did. That reduced mortality with 50%. That's what we saw during the war. That if you sort of improve the motivation of the staff, you may have enormous risk on mortality. And the last thing I'm going to show you here, after the war we have pursued this observation on the enormous effect on measles vaccine during the war. And we have actually done a randomized trial where we have given measles vaccine at 4 months and 9 months, which will sort of be a new suggestion for our policy. And we have tested against what is the normal policy at the moment. That would be DTP-free at 4 months, and then measles vaccine at 9 months. And that reduced mortality with 49%. There's no way we can explain this with our current understanding. This has virtually nothing to do with measles, prevention of measles. But it has to do with stimulating the immune system. And I think it's important that we understand that our interventions are immune stimulatory. And that can go beneficially, but it can also be negative.